As with all photography, the first thing you need to learn, if you don't know this already, is the relationship between ISO, shutter speed and aperture, and how to balance these three things to correctly expose your photographs. I'm not going to go into too much depth on this, but I'll leave you some links below so that you can do your own research. The second thing you need to do is download the manual for your camera off the internet and read it from cover to cover, so that you understand exactly how it works, how to use all the menus, and what all the buttons do. Now, this is a bit tedious and time consuming, but it is really important. Just using automatic will not give you the best results. Once you've done this, set your camera to manual and just get out there and start shooting with it until you get the hang of it. Okay, so briefly, ISO is the sensitivity, for want of a better word, of your digital sensor. In the old days, it was the sensitivity of the film stock. Higher ISO allows you to shoot in lower light, but it also produces more grain or noise. Copywork requires the maximum possible sharpness, so your ISO should be set to 100. The aperture of a camera is a diaphragm made up of several metal blades which open and close to let in more or less light. The lower the f number, the more wide open the diaphragm. So f2, for example, is open and f22 is narrow. Different lenses vary in the maximum amount of light they can let in. Some can only go to f4, others go to f1.2. The aperture also has a secondary effect on depth of field. Depth of field is the size of the area in front of and behind the focal point that appears to be sharp. The wider open the aperture, the narrower the depth of field. So if you take a picture of someone's face at f2 focusing on their left eye, that eye will be the only part of the image that's sharp. Everything else will be blurred. Whereas at f22, everything will appear to be in focus. The distance to your subject, the sensor size of your camera, and the focal length of your lens also all have an effect on the depth of field. So the closer the subject, the bigger the sensor size, and the longer the focal length of your lens, the more blur or bokeh you can get. Which is why camera phones, with their tiny sensors and lenses, always have a really wide depth of field, and don't produce bokeh. Again, for copywork, our aim is to get the sharpest possible image from edge to edge. Because our artwork is flat in front of the camera, we don't have to worry about depth of field. However, different lenses do have an aperture sweet spot for sharpness, normally a few stops down from the widest f-stop. To work out yours, you'll need to do a test. Set everything up as I'm about to show you, and take a series of pictures, from the highest to the lowest f-stop, and then check them on the computer. See where the image is the sharpest from edge to edge, right into the corners, and that's the aperture that you should use. The final element of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. This is the speed at which the shutter opens and closes when you take a picture. It affects the amount of light let into the camera, and also has a secondary effect of either freezing or blurring motion. This is irrelevant for us though, and because ISO and aperture have already been determined, you just need to set the shutter speed to whatever will give you the correct exposure. Typically, even with powerful lights, at f9 the shutter speed will need to be quite slow. So you not only need to use a tripod, but either a remote trigger or the camera's timer, so that you're not touching the camera at all when the picture is taken. So how do you determine correct exposure? Well, first use the camera's light meter. Adjust the shutter speed until the mark on the gauge lines up with the arrow. This is not always accurate though, particularly when there's a lot of white in the shot. So the second thing you need to do is look at the histogram. The histogram is a visual representation of the pixels, arranged from dark on the left side to light on the right. If the chart is piled up on either end, then usually the exposure is wrong, and you'll need to adjust the shutter speed above or below what the camera is telling you is correct. Finally, you need to check your photos on the computer monitor. This is absolutely essential. Don't rely on the camera screen, it's just not good enough. After you've taken a few shots, always check them on a monitor. Even better, if you have a laptop, is to use tethered capture in Lightroom. It's really easy. You just connect the camera via USB, then go to File, Tethered Capture, and it should find your camera. Then you can fire the shutter from your laptop so that you don't need a remote trigger. It saves the files directly into Lightroom, and you can view the images on screen immediately as you take them. I actually don't have a laptop, I have an iPad, so I just use a card reader with my desktop. But if you do, it is great. The other really important thing you need to do is to go into the camera settings and set the image type to RAW instead of JPEG. Never use JPEGs for this type of work. JPEGs are compressed, so the image quality is not as good to start with. Plus they bake in many of the camera's settings, like colour profile and white balance, into the file. RAW files are bigger, and unlike JPEGs, which can be used as they are, they have to be processed. But the image quality is higher, and almost everything about them is editable, so you don't need to worry too much about the colour at the beginning, as this can all be done at the end. Take white balance, for example. This setting defines what is white, which in turn is determined by the colour temperature of the lighting. For example, tungsten emits a very yellow light, but if you adjust the white balance accordingly, the yellow colour cast will be completely removed and will appear neutral. If you're shooting JPEG, this, and the colour space in general, should really be set up correctly before you take the shot. With RAW, you can sort it out afterwards in post. Now it is still good practice to adjust the camera's white balance at the beginning of the shoot though, just to make it easier to monitor your shots as you go along. You can do this by setting up your custom white balance in camera, and your manual will show you how to do this. Or if you're using daylight coloured lights at around 5600 Kelvin, you can just set it up to daylight and it should be close enough. Just get yourself a grey card and take a picture of it in front of the artwork when you start. They're not expensive. Using a colour card like Datacolor's Spider Checker is even better, as it will also help you get accurate colours later on, though they are more expensive. Finally, set your lens's focus to manual. You'll get sharper focus with manual than you will with autofocus. Get it about right, then use the digital zoom to zoom right in and refine it. On my Canon, the zoom buttons are top right with blue plus and minus symbols next to them. Press the blue plus twice to completely zoom in, then once again to zoom out. Okay, so with the camera sorted, you'll need to set up your studio. You'll need a space somewhere between 3x3, 3x4 meters, depending on the size of your work and the focal length of your lens. If you do massive paintings and use a really long lens, then obviously you'll need more room. Personally, I use my kitchen, as it's the only space I have that's big enough, as my studio is tiny. I just remove the chairs and move the table to one side. It's best to block off most, if not all of the light in the room apart from your photography lights. Shooting at night can help with this. So how should you mount your work? For paintings, you can use your easel. Now lugging easels about is a pain. However, once it's in place, you should be able to position the work securely and precisely vertical, which is really important. For prints, I attach them to a flat piece of fiberboard using low-tack painter's masking tape, like frog tape or 3M blue. You tear off a piece, stick it to itself, and attach one on either corner and in the middle on the rear. When you've finished, if you remove the tape slowly and carefully, it shouldn't damage the paper. Never, ever use normal masking tape or any kind of high-tack tape to do this because it will tear. Don't try to photograph anything behind glass, it won't work. If it's already been framed, you'll need to remove it. Next, use a measuring tape to measure the height from the centre of the painting to the floor. So measure the artwork, divide it by 2, measure to the floor and make a note of it. Do the same thing for the horizontal centre and stick a piece of masking tape onto the floor to mark it. Run the measuring tape, or a long stick, as straight as possible from the tape into the centre of the room. Attach your camera to the tripod and set it up over the top of this line so that your artwork is in frame on the viewfinder. Stick another piece of tape down on this line, directly underneath the lens. Measure from the floor to the centre of the lens and adjust the tripod so that it's exactly the same height as from the floor to the centre of the artwork. All things being well, your lens should be precisely centred to the middle of the painting, horizontally and vertically. Then, set up the lights at 45-degree angles from the painting about a couple of metres back. Unless you have a huge room, it will probably be as far to the walls as you can go. Make sure both lights are exactly the same distance apart from the centre line and back from the painting. They should basically be a mirror image of each other along the centre line. If you're using flashes, set up your remote triggers now. Adjust the stand so that the centre of the lights are exactly the same height as from the floor to the centre of the artwork. Aim the left light to the left side and the right light to the right side. Do some test shots and make adjustments as necessary to get the lighting even. If you're photographing an oil painting or a glossy acrylic painting, now is the time to set up the filters for cross-polarization. First, place the linear polarization filter over the lights. Because my LED monolights get quite hot, I tape the filter onto a homemade greyboard frame, then clamp them onto my backdrop stands and place them in front of the lights. Just be aware that linear polarization filter sheets have something like a grain direction. If I put my frames up to the light, with one in front of the other, you can see through them. But if I turn one 90 degrees, it goes dark. This is at the heart of how cross-polarization works. It filters the direction of the light waves. So just make sure that the filters over both lights are in the same direction. Then, screw the filter onto the end of the lens. Once it's on, you can twist it without unscrewing it. Switch the lights on and twist it round. And once it gets to the right point, the glare, like magic, will disappear. Do note though, if your painting has any metal paint or leaf, as mine does here, using this technique will absolutely kill that lovely shininess. In which case, you can either choose not to use it and just try to control the glare with the lighting, or you can take two pictures, one with cross-polarization and one without, and composite them in Photoshop. First, take a picture of your grey card or colour card directly in front of the piece. Next, you'll need to get the painting perfectly square within the image frame. This is a bit of a faff. It's a question of take a shot, review the image, make an adjustment and repeat. The tricky bit is knowing which element needs adjusting. Potentially the painting could be askew on 3 different axes. Now assuming you've set up the camera to the correct height and that it's dead straight, if the painting recedes on both sides on the vertical axis, either up or down, then the painting is probably leaning towards or away from the camera. If it recedes on both sides on the horizontal axis, then it's probably not square in front of the camera. If one side recedes in one direction and the other side in another, then, like a picture frame, it's probably not sitting straight on the horizontal. Once everything's correct, refocus manually using the zoom function, and take a bunch of shots. Again, either use a remote trigger or the timer, don't touch the camera. Once you've checked on your monitor that you've definitely got the shot, only then go back and take some close-up shots. And leave the equipment up for as long as possible whilst you're editing to make sure that you have what you need. There's nothing more annoying than taking it all down and then having to put it all back up again when you realise that you've missed something.